right now we're having a disclosure plan kind of like starting to unfold with UFOs being suddenly talked about ad nauseum in the mainstream media. At the moment it's a threat, but it soon can easily morph into something else. Do you feel, how do you feel about that? I mean, is there a bigger disclosure plan happening and that you're part of this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the whole point of many of us, and when I say many, I mean, we're talking millions and millions of different, what we call starseeds coming in. And once this process of evolution of the human race has been completed, many of us will go to another planet where they're third density going into fourth, and it's just the process. Because what it is, once your race has moved on past like the fourth density or so into the fifth, especially, then you've come together enough that you can go and assist other races in their ascension. And so that's just the process. It's very normal, but it's important that even if you're coming in as another race, that you have to incarnate through that whatever race, in this case is human. You have to incarnate through the humans to have the human experience, to maintain the free will abrogation, so that you don't land a giant spacecraft, into a society that can't handle it, that'll start shooting at you, or that will start shooting at one another, because out of fear, and right now we're not 100% out of that. So like you say, there will be a layout. The plan for Earth and for humans is for it to become more common to see UFOs, so that it will be no big deal. It might be cool to watch, but you're like, okay, yeah, it's a UFO, I get it now. Then the next step will be with them communicating with people more directly, and then, eventually someday landing on the Earth. And it truly depends on humans and how we approach the situation. If we can come together as a human race and say, okay, let's accept this. This is the fact. Let's not freak out. Let's not start shooting at things and start going crazy. If we can get to that point, they'll land as soon as we're there, but we're just not there yet.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
It's my great pleasure to welcome back to Exopolitics Today, Chris O'Connor. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me back, and hello, everybody.
Well, we have done one interview before in late September, early October that it came out, where we talked about your memories of being part of a UN-run secret space program, and that you served 3 20 bags. And what made your case kind of very unusual for me was that you actually began by being age progressed from the age of 2 to the age 25 when you began your first 20 back. So you want to just maybe recap for those that don't remember or who haven't heard you before, why it was that at 2 years old that you were identified as someone of value to this secret space program that was in existence at that time in the early 1970s.
Right. Well, essentially, prior to incarnating into this, this body in 1968 is when I was born. Prior to that, we actually, my soul group, my soul family, and myself had a contract with the United States that I would incarnate, and that I don't know if I remember they said age of 2 or whatever, but at 2 years old, that they would take me, advance me through their technology, and then I'd work 20 years for United States, doing various things, a lot of which, are unrelated to all of the emissary type of stuff I did for the UN. But then after 20 years, I would begin working with a space-based United Nations. It has connection to the United Nations here on Earth, but it's not the same exact organization. It's like an offshoot. So yeah, so it was pre-planned. That's how they knew, to find me.
Right. So with that first pointing back program, your age progressed from age 2, and this took place in 1970.
Yes.
And so suddenly you're in a 25-year-old body, but you have your memories not of a 2-year-old, but of your prior life or lives. And so you served for 20 years in a US space program. Now, was that the Solar Warden program, the beginning of that? I mean, what do you recall of that particular program?
Well, interestingly, I'm really bad with names. So I'm a very visual person. I see everything visually, and so I interpret things that way. And so I don't remember exactly which organization it was at first. I feel like it was Solar Warden, but I can't say for certain because I just don't have that exact memory. But yeah, so it was definitely the United States, though. Yeah.
Do you remember anything about the uniforms that the personnel wore and what kind of ships they were flying on?
What I do remember is I was a good amount of time on Earth as well. And actually the uniforms were just like a navy blue, very simple uniforms, almost kind of security guard sort of a look. They were very simple. I do remember one patch that was, of course, no, I'm sorry, that was later on for United Nations, that patch that I do remember that one, but I don't remember any insignias or logos. I don't remember anybody wearing one.
So that's very interesting. So of course, people, when they think of the Navy, they think of the dress whites or the white uniforms they wear, but the Navy also have kind of blue camouflage uniforms, which presumably kind of make it harder to distinguish someone in the ocean or in the water in one of those. So that's associated with kind of like combat duties, security duties. So you were involved in security duties for that first 20 years.
I do definitely have memories of that, working with with some of the children that they were actually training. And I know that was on Earth, out in the deserts of California. And I do remember some gray uniforms that were very just plain, like medium, darkish gray.
Mm-hmm. Now, at that point, I mean, we're talking that first 20 years. I mean, 1970, the beginning of this kind of secret space programs in the US. So you're an advanced ET soul that's incarnated in human, in a human body. Your age progressed. You're now part of this secret space program. You're doing security work. So was that because you had the kind of DNA and the consciousness where you could interface or interact with kind of like advanced ET technologies or artifacts in a way that made it possible for those things to be investigated, researched? Was that kind of like, does that ring a bell for what the sort of things you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I would work on a number of things. Part of it was memory and soul transfer and consciousness, transfer from a body to a clone, or saving somebody or removing memory. So I was working with that. I remember doing some security detail work. I did a number of things, most of which are pretty well blocked off, but I definitely have memory of those circumstances, working in very small white rooms that were like medical type of rooms that would work with like extracting memory from someone, or if there's an emergency, say if a soldier was injured and their body was dying, we'd transfer the consciousness and the memories, from their dying body to generally a clone. Now, I know they had technology to repair bodies, but this is only if they couldn't repair it. It was pretty too far gone.
Well,
and even sometimes after they died, we could transfer it if we have a couple of hours.
Well, I find that to be an interesting parallel with my Army insider JP, who you met at the what was it? The Galactic Spiritual
Yeah.
Informers Connection Conference. You met
Yes.
him, and he is an extraterrestrial contactee, and when he began serving with the Army, so his active duty, they put him on security details. So when he does these off-world missions, he's on security details, which, at first it sounds strange. Well, why would you use an ET contactee who presumably has higher consciousness and is able to communicate with ETs? Why would you use them on security details? But it sounds like similar considerations, that people like you, like him, have the genetics, the DNA, so that you could go into places or interact with certain things and make it a safe environment.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of that technology, because when you incarnate into a physical form here in third density, you bring a DNA, a trace of that with you, of your soul, what your native race. And so it's that DNA that a lot of this technology that the United States trades for is built by other races. So most people, humans, don't actually have that, DNA trace that can operate. Either sometimes it ships, sometimes it's just technology. And so that's why they make deals, with these races for certain people, that they know will be able to operate certain things and go certain places, like you say.
That's absolutely correct. That I know that's what JP has told me, that the Nordics that he has been in touch with, that been interacting with him, made agreements with the US military, and part of those agreements were that JP would be looked after, and of course then he enlisted, and he's been continuing to release information, and I think this is part of the agreements between the Nordics and the military. So that makes absolute sense why they would identify a 2-year-old as having the genetics and the consciousness to be useful in a secret space program. And so they go through the whole age progression and age regression thing. So that does make sense. Even though it's a bit of a stretch for a lot of people. I think a 2-year-old, come on, seriously, Salla?
Yeah, exactly. How can a 2-year-old have the free will to make this choice? Well, the fact is it was made prior to incarnation.
Yeah, and the critical thing is that 2-year-old has the genetics and the consciousness that would be of value to a secret space program, and they have the technology to age progress and age reverse at that time. So definitely, I think that makes it very plausible what you said. Okay, so for the first 20 years, from 1970 to 1990, you're in this US military secret space program. Presumably the Navy, Solar Warden, but you're not sure of that. Right. Now, towards the end of the 1980s was a critical time, because you had the kind of end of the Cold War, the crash of the Berlin Wall, and you have these very strange statements by President Ronald Reagan at the United Nations and elsewhere, saying that there was a great need for the US and the Soviet Union to collaborate in facing an extraterrestrial threat. And there's a very famous clip where he's standing before the United Nations General Assembly, I think it was September 1987, and he literally says that, wouldn't it be better if the Earth's nations learn to cooperate in dealing with an extraterrestrial threat? And isn't such a threat in front of us right now? And of course, people thought, well, he's just being a lunatic or something. But in fact, at that very time, a United Nations secret space program was being formed. And I did write about this in several of my books, that actually that was what led to the creation of a United Nations secret space program. And you come into this because you actually, at the end of your first 20 and back in 1990, then you made a kind of lateral move from the US military-run space program into this newly formed United Nations space program. So you want to kind of pick up from there and tell us what you know about that formative period.
Yeah, you're exactly right. After that first 20 years, the agreement was for me to incarnate through and be used with the first United States, whether it's the Air Force or the Navy or both, because I remember feeling like there were both at times, depending on where we would travel. But the agreement was for the first 20 years, they would get my service. And then they would supply like transportation and all these other things for me. But I will actually be moved over to United Nations representing Earth rather than it's just the United States. So that was kind of the deal that was struck prior, to me incarnating, was that that's how we would work it. And so they would actually provide transportation out to Saturn, to Mimas, and during that time, there are these races that were coming in, like you mentioned in that time of the end of the Cold War, they were working with a number of nations, anyone that had real military power or might or the ability to leave the planet at some level. Because they also knew that, that we had to learn to get along before we can actually be a fully off-planet race as far as a whole human race. And so they began working to put the United Nations group together. It was formed through the United Nations because that was the best organization at the time for these outside sources to come in and work with. Though they communicated individually, like certain races would communicate with the Russians, some with the Chinese, and others with the United States and the UK and France and these other nations. But they would all come together through the United Nations because that was what we'd already established here on Earth. And so they honored that. But they did create a branch of the Earth-based United Nations that's more off-planet.
Well, that's a very interesting kind of like perspective, because one of the things that has always puzzled scholars is, why the Cold War ended the way it did. Why did the Soviet Union kind of like let go of its empire? It let go of the Warsaw Pact countries, and it allowed itself to actually disintegrate from a kind of like a unitary government with 15 provinces into 15 different nations, and that ended the Soviet Union and led to the Russian Federation being a very weak shadow of the former Soviet Union. So why did that happen? And one of the explanations, of course, is that the Soviet Union knew that they couldn't keep up with the advances in kind of like Star Wars and advanced space weapons. They couldn't keep up with it. And so a deal was struck whereby the United States would like begin collaborating with the Soviet Union in terms of space activities, and that a United Nations space program would be created where all of the nations would collaborate so that the technology would be shared. And so this was one of the conditions for the end of the Cold War. And certainly it explains why the Cold War ended the way it did, without there being, shots fired between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. It was all done peacefully. And the only fighting that took place was in Romania because of the civil war there between the army and the secret police. But it was all done peacefully. And that, to me, suggests that behind the scenes, there was some deal that was struck. And I think that this creation of a United Nations secret space program was probably one of the main reasons why the Cold War ended.
I would agree with that entirely, because, those talks began mid-1960s. These races had already begun contacting, each of the nations, and it took quite a while, for them to really come together, because we had to get over a lot of stuff. That's been our human process, is getting over those idiosyncrasies that we hold on to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you formally begin working in the United Nations Secret Space Program in 1990. That's your first, and you sign a 20-year contract, and then you're relocated to the Saturn moon Mimas. So why would a United Nations space program that involves the leading nations on Earth, why would they establish a headquarters on the Saturnian moon Mimas, or Mimas, how
Well,
do you pronounce it?
Mimas, yes. Well, they established several different locations because there are at least 3 that I can recall different confederations or federations in just our solar system alone. They're all connected, but they're just different locations. And so you have to have a representation at each of those. So they had one in Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. And I think they had like a small, a couple of small ones that are just outposts and like in a couple of small planetoids and asteroids. But yeah, they needed to have representation where they're going, because not all, because some locations are higher densities that not all entities can interact with. So they have to have a location for that. And there's technology to help adjust, but you can't spend a lot of time outside of your density. So you have to have technology. So they just try to make it as easy as possible, which is why they kind of split confederations and federations up a bit, just logistically, to allow as many different races to be a part of it as possible.
Well, we know on Earth that the United Nations has headquarters in Geneva and New York City. So what you're saying is that the United Nations Secret Space Program has, I guess, headquarters on those 3 areas, like the Mimas on Saturn, Jupiter. What you didn't say where on Jupiter, in the clouds?
Yeah, I wasn't connected with them. I was only Mimas, so all my memories are primarily Mimas. But I know they were in Jupiter and Neptune as well.
Okay, all right. So tell us then, what do you recall about that United Nations Secret Space Program headquarters that you operated out of on Mimas?
Mimas. Well, I'll say first off, due to the nature of my work was telepathic. And so when you're this is a large space station. It's like the radius is about 250 miles. So it's huge. It has hundreds of thousands of entities in it of different types. So what we would have, and it resides primarily in a higher density, the 8th density. So different parts of the station have, like, I call them Faraday cages. Is the closest thing I can come to them, because you can kind of control a density within that type of environment, like a metal room, basically, and control the density. And so for most of the time, I was actually in stasis. So a lot of what I did through holographic work, which I recently remembered that. So I'm really grateful for that, because things didn't make sense until, I realized, oh my gosh, that was holographic work that I was doing. So, but a lot of times I was in physical presence with a lot of these entities in meetings and boardrooms and things. But those were with entities that were of a similar vibration and density that we could kind of come together. We would sometimes have to wear, I don't know what we call them, but they were just these belt type of things and a suit that allowed you to be in a higher density as a 3rd density entity that I was. But I couldn't do that for very long. And I couldn't stay at this 8th density location for too terribly long unless I was in a stasis pod. And I think Jean-Charles Moyen, and he and his wife Melanie, they're both in security detail as well. They actually both recently told me that they remembered me being in stasis. They actually physically saw me there, and that was kind of really interesting to know. Somebody remembered that. But so most of the time I was in stasis. When I wasn't in stasis, the station is very round. It's just a big, looks like the Death Star, really. That's the closest thing we can come to explaining what it is, just a big ball out in space. And within that space, or within that space station, there are different locations that for different types of entities. Like there's a large ocean space. There's spaces that are very hot, spaces that are very cold, depending on the entity that the delegation of that entity, what they require for their atmospheric needs. I, of course, stayed when I wasn't in stasis. I was in stasis over 80% of the time. And that was because of the density, but also so that I couldn't be interfered with, on a telepathic level, because I had information that, didn't need to get out, to other races necessarily. When you're just negotiating things, there's just ways you do things, and so would be inappropriate for me to be accessible to any higher advanced, telepathic entity to come in and just take everything out of my mind that they want telepathically. So I was in stasis for those two reasons. But when I wasn't in stasis, it was like a giant shopping mall, really. It was like, I don't know how many stories, they were all very, very large areas, that you would think you were in a really slick sci-fi type of movie, that was all kind of glass and chrome and just white, like white marble looking. I don't know that it was marble. And then also trees and waterfalls, because the atmosphere where I was, most of the time was, of course, oxygen, hydrogen based, like we breathe, but it was very, very enriched. It's like at times it was almost that you didn't have to breathe because your body was absorbing this atmosphere and it had enough oxygen in the blood system. And so breathing was sort of secondary versus primary. But it was just a beautiful environment. There were people milling around, and when I wasn't just spending some time with friends that I had there, co-workers and friends, I would generally be in stasis. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of memories of living day to day on the station.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned Jean-Charles Moyen and his wife Melanie as actually seeing you in one of these stasis chambers, because right there you have kind of like independent corroboration or support for what you were saying, because I'm sure a lot of people are trying to wrap their minds around what you've been saying. But that's, and I know Jean-Charles, I mean, he has said that he had this deja vu experience when he saw you at the Galactic Spiritual Informers Conference. So do you remember that? I mean, what happened? Just tell my audience, what happened when you met Jean-Charles Moyen in October in Orlando.
Yeah, it was really interesting. He kind of froze up a little bit. He was just, there's like things connecting in his brain all of a sudden, and it was, and just within a few seconds, we started to talk. For the first couple of seconds, we just looked at each other. It's like, oh my gosh, I remember you. It's you, and it was just like, it was just this remarkable feeling of seeing a family member or a friend you haven't seen in years and years, and you have missed them, and suddenly they're standing right in front of you. And it's a joyous feeling. It's absolutely joyous.
So did he say anything to you about having met you when you weren't in the stasis chamber? I mean, I assume, the fact that he and his wife, who was also part of the secret space program, the joint French-US secret space program, that they were standing over your stasis chamber for a reason. Obviously, they would have known that you were a representative for the Earth in this very sensitive kind of United Nations diplomatic outpost there on Mimas. So because the kind of impression I got was that he knew you from interacting with you, that he had met you as opposed to just seeing you in a stationary in a stasis chamber.
Yeah, we were friends. Yeah, we were friends. And it wasn't until after the conference that a lot of our memories came through, which that's kind of how recovering memories works. You have like a spark, and then it takes a little while, a little ember has to burn for a while, and then the memories float up to the consciousness. And so in that process, we had remembered that we were friends, and we had been very close, and we'd known each other for many years. And though we hadn't mentioned why they were in the stasis chamber and why they would see me in there, we haven't really discussed that. My feeling is that they were probably just, checking and making sure everything was okay.
And the timelines match too, because I remember Jean-Charles saying he began serving on this joint US French secret space program in the 1990s that he did a 20 and back with them. So that overlaps with your time. So clearly that was possible that he and you met, and it makes sense that if he's serving on a joint French-US space carrier, he called it the Solaris, that the Solaris would have had a lot to do with this United Nations space program headquarters there on Mimas.
Yeah, well, because the United Nations at that time didn't have any ships, didn't have any transportation, so they utilized what was available. And the primary organization that had set up interstellar really, but within our solar system travel was the Navy, or the Air Force, sorry. Outside of our solar system was more Navy. They had better ships.
I see.
But yeah, but then I think later on the United Nations actually, did obtain some ships that they used for their own, but they weren't as large, or they weren't like battleships.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so within Mimas, you described almost like this futuristic kind of shopping mall type facility there, where there was lots of personnel. So can you describe, what was it like in terms of personnel? Are we talking predominantly humans, from different countries, France, China, Russia, or are we talking about a mixture of humans, Nordics, other types of extraterrestrials? Can you describe that?
Absolutely. There were a lot of humans, Earth humans, of all races, but the majority of what was on the station that I would see were non-human. A lot of humanoid forms, some entities that were very tall that looked exactly human. There were entities that looked like what we call Sasquatch. There were entities that looked like insectoid. I'm just trying to think of their name, but I'm terrible with names. Some of the ant people, we call them as well, are there. There were people that looked, they're all blue. They look human for the most part, but were blue and had like translucent skin and shiny, beautiful white hair. And there's quite a few races that were different shades of blue. Most of those were humanoid. There were entities that looked like, lions and cats, and some of them looked sort of more canine as well. They were from different planets, different races. There's just one of my favorite races is a race that looked like a macaque or a rhesus monkey that just stood up and became human suddenly, but they have that look and they're highly intelligent and they love humanity and love human beings, and they love human clothes. They wear human clothes a lot. They have a thing for that. So there was just an amazing array, and a lot of entities that were mostly light, that would look maybe plasma, but they could kind of take a form so that, we could have something to look at, kind of shape themselves in a, like a light body type of thing. So it was just a huge array. Do you remember anything about the different kind of Earth nations that were part of this UN outpost there at Mimas? I mean, for example, was it clear the difference between, say, someone from China as opposed to someone from Russia or someone from France? I mean, did they wear the similar uniforms just with a different patch, a national patch? I mean, well, what do you remember about the Earth humans that were there and their uniforms? Well, there's different variations of Earth humans that were there, meaning that some of them were military, some of them were actual residents, maybe families of representatives that were there, but they never acted as a separate nation or race. We were always humans, Earth humans. We were always Earth humans, no matter what, which is like, it just brings joy to my heart knowing that's how it was and that's how it'll eventually be here. We just got to get there. But we were never, because, when you're leaving the planet and you're somewhere, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of miles away, and you're with your other fellow Earthlings, you're from Earth. You're not from a country. and that was the camaraderie that we all had together. So there wasn't, there were civilian clothes, and, you could necessarily always tell the difference from where they were from, but we couldn't necessarily, I don't recall all of us knowing the same language, but it didn't really matter. For the most part, we were all from Earth, and we were all Earthlings.
So, I mean, how was the communication done between the Earthlings? And I assume that with the extraterrestrials, it was largely telepathic. But with the Earthlings, I mean, was English the lingua franca, or was there some translation device, or how was that done? Do you remember?
I don't remember a translation device, though. I remember that there was something, but I don't know what that was. For myself, when they unlocked all of my previous memories, I had a number of languages that I could speak. And that, of course, was when I was returned, and, after 60 years back as a 2-year-old, then those memories were taken back out. It wasn't appropriate for me to be born with them. So I think a lot of the people that were there, they were there because they had the ability to be multilingual. So communicating, I don't ever remember it being a problem, but I don't remember a specific, like a device that caused us to understand one another.
Now, this United Nations outpost on Mimas included the major spacefaring nations, or those with space programs at the time. We could, kind of list them off: China, France, India, Britain, US, and so forth. But what about the German program, or the Dark Fleet, or Nachtwaffen? Was that represented there on Mimas?
Well, it was a really difficult problem that they were races, there were factions of the human race that were off doing their own thing, and certainly some of those that you mentioned were actually mostly off planet on either asteroids or another planet that was occupied by humans. But they generally had an interest, in being there from time to time, but they were short-time visitors because they really didn't want anything to do with us as far as other Earth humans. They felt like they'd left us, and they left us behind. The unfortunate thing was that how you're seen as a galactic race, as an up-and-coming race, as we humans currently are, you're seeing that if you fracture off and you leave your planet, you're still seen as Earth humans for quite a long period of time. So whatever these negative dark fleets would go off and do, it still came back to the United Nations. We're still responsible for their actions. So we had to meet with them to try to work out a deal so we can go back to, the delegation on Mimas and actually make apologies a lot of times, and renegotiate things because of some of the stuff these other human factions were doing. But like I said, reason we have to all get along here on Earth, and the reason most of the, galactic races haven't just come and landed on Earth for the most part, is because we're not getting along with ourselves, and that we don't understand and realize that we're held responsible for all the other humans. Every single one of us is responsible for every other one of us. And that's just how it's looked at. That's just how it's done. So that, yes, there were some of the dark fleet that would come from time to time, but begrudgingly so, and they wouldn't stay long.
Mm-hmm. So almost like a family where you have the parents being held to account for an unruly child that goes out there and creates havoc in the neighborhood, and you have to knock on the neighbor's door, say, sorry, what my son did, to your lawn, and what he did to your fence, and sorry about that. And so it sounds like that's pretty much what you were doing a lot of the time.
It was a lot, yeah, a lot of the time, because it was known that what race I was, what my native race was, and it was known by a lot of other delegations. A lot of the other races knew who I was natively. They could tell. They're telepathic. They could see it instantly, and so my race was a very trusted race. So that's why I would, do a lot of the negotiating and go in and have conversations with these other races. Now, I was never in charge of those small meetings we had. I was usually just there as the anchor point, because my race was trusted, but also because I don't have it so much now because, you return to Earth and you forget all these things, but a very strong telepathic ability that I could communicate during meetings with other entities. And so I would just report in and say, listen, things aren't going well, or things are going great, keep going, keep doing what you're doing. But I was not the one in charge. I was always with at least two other people that were, outranked me essentially.
Mm-hmm. So now it's worth kind of emphasizing here that, at that point, you've only kind of lived 2 years on Earth as a baby, even though now you're in your second 20 and back program. Of course, you spent 20 years in the military space program. So are you regarded as kind of like a fellow extraterrestrial or as a human? Because you were brought in because of your extraterrestrial heritage, and I think you mentioned Andromedans at some point. So did the extraterrestrials see you like as an Andromedan, or did they see you as a human with Andromedan kind of characteristics? I mean, how did they perceive you?
Well, I don't 100% know, or actually I do, but I'm not really allowed to say what my native race is. It does kind of go through a number of races. I have definitely incarnated through Andromedan. But when you're seeing it, it depends on the individual and the awareness of the individual. So in my case, when I would come into contact with the vast majority of them were much more advanced telepathically and much more advanced technologically. So easy read, real easy to read as a human physical form. So they would see me and they would be able to know what I was already aware of. For the most part, I was aware of everything, who I was, what my native race was, the reason I was there, so they could communicate with me on that level. But many of the other people I was with that were human, like my security detail I had that traveled with me and such as that, their awareness was more limited because it needed to be. And so they would go at that level, so it was about the individual and whatever the individual was aware of internally.
Okay, in our last interview, you talked about a meeting that you were in where, like in the first year of you being in the United Nations secret space programs on Mimas, that you were shot and killed by an extraterrestrial that was very angry over what the Nakwaffen had done on their planet, killing hundreds of thousands, and you were killed, and I guess your body was killed, but your consciousness or soul extract was transferred into a clone. Yes. So that was one incident you described. So I just wanted to kind of get you to, if you want to elaborate on that, and then describe, were there other incidents you remember from that first 20-year period in the United Nations secret space program?
Yeah, it's really interesting that I tend to remember things that are like really impactful, and being shot and killed would be one. So that is a very defined memory, and just for the sake of viewers that haven't heard what this was about, very quickly, there was these dark fleets that went to a planet and were trying to talk them out of some of their resources. I believe it was some type of quartz they wanted, and the race wouldn't turn it over for free. They were like, no, we need to, trade. So basically, they just attacked, the Dark Fleet attacked, killed about 300,000 of these individuals and took what they wanted anyway. Well, of course, this race was very angry. Now, this race, they're not quite like, say, a Vulcan, in Star Trek that, have suppressed their emotions entirely, though for the most part they have. But they don't like to show emotion. They choose not to show emotion, but they feel it. And this obviously was a highly emotional situation. We were sitting in a boardroom. There was myself and my two superiors to my left at sort of like a small boardroom. I guess the room would be about 20 foot, each direction. And then there was three of this other race, very tall, They had tall gray skin, but they had like a triangular type of head. And they were doing their best to control their emotion, but it wasn't working very well because of the fact that 300,000 of them were killed. And they were there because we were desperately trying to, tell them, we'll find a way to make it right, because they were headed to Earth. They were pissed off. And we didn't know exactly what they were going to do, but it wasn't going to be good for Earth. So we stepped in there, and they were negotiating with my two superiors, but I could tell the main guy in charge of these other entities was feeling that he was not being heard. And so I told, my superiors to listen, it's, you're not getting through, you're cold, and he's feeling like you're not understanding the gravity of the situation. So, in that sort of moment of not feeling like he's being heard and understood, he got very angry. It snapped. And so he just ran his hand across his chest like this. And then this beam of, say, the center of his chest, kind of like a green beam, came out. And so he was only about 6 feet from me across the table. And this beam hit me about this area. And it just like fried me. I mean, I was gone. I didn't die right away, but I fell back, and, they had to very quickly, because, they had clones of, certain people that for these type of emergencies, so there's one available on the space station. So they got me to medical right away. They were able to transfer my consciousness and memories, capture it and transfer it to the clone before it dissipated, because I did die in the room, actually. So that's what happened. So I had a brand new 25-year-old body again, so that wasn't bad. But also the good thing is that entity, he became my friend. And he has actually visited me here on Earth one time, and just checking in to see how things were going. But he really meant to kind of like share that beam across and kill all three of us. But the second he hit me, he felt regret. And so he shut that beam off. And because of that, and after that moment, I heard later that they were able to come to an agreement, because they realized that they had lost it, and they wanted to make that right. So they were able to come to an agreement. Oh, I can't hear you, Michael.
Diplomats certainly earn their pay.
I did that day.
Yeah.
So
that was one incident in that period. Were there any other incidents in that kind of first 20 years within the United Nations Secret Space Program you remember?
There are a couple that I'm currently working on, trying to make sense of the memories, because they don't all come in like linearly. They kind of come in as a puzzle, taken apart, and I'm still putting them together. So I don't think it'd be appropriate really to share it yet. But I will certainly when I get that puzzle put back together. That's just the most impactful one, and the one I remember the most, that I could stand and say, this is the absolute truth and this is what happened.
Okay.
All the other things are flashes.
All right. So that happened around 1991. So in 2000, 1991, so 2010, I guess, your 20-year and back with the United Nations is over, and you decide to re-enlist to serve again. Mm-hmm. And I guess, are you given a new clone body, or are you age regressed? What happened?
Well, during that negotiation, I was kind of adamant, there's certain things, if I'm going to join for 20 more years. And it's interesting that I had to, it was still through the Earth base, obviously, but the United States, because I was a United States citizen and I was brought in through the United States. So I had to do all my negotiating through them, and they had to agree first for everything. So I negotiated, my terms, like a payout and such as that when I, retire. So at that negotiation, one of my points that I negotiated was, because I'm 45-ish. I'm like, I want my 25-year-old body again, So as part of my negotiation, I was moved into a 25-year-old clone again. And I served my last 20 years. But at the end of the full 60 years, then what they would do, or what they did with me, was they had a clone of my 2-year-old body. And then they removed most of my memory, the vast majority of it. And then my consciousness, they just moved into that 2-year-old body. So basically I was a 2-year-old again with no memory of anything. And so they returned me back to 1970.
Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting that, I mean, you return back to 1970, you live a normal life, but that Chris O'Connor, that's part of the United Nations Secret Space Program that began the third 20 and back in 2010 is still serving right now.
Yes,
and
he has a different name, but yes.
Different name, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you're still serving, and I think the last time we talked, you didn't have any memories of that third Secret Space Program term of service, but you did an interview with Elena Danaan a month or two ago, where you actually started to get some memories, and this concerned the Anunnaki and Enki. So you want to tell us, like, what did you remember?
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of my and when I mentioned about memories coming in as puzzle pieces, and you have to put them together to create a story and make sense of your memory, was I had always remembered being on the balcony of like what I thought was a mall at the time, with 4 or 5 security that were in gray suits, and we were having a discussion on this mezzanine next to a large doorway that was to my right. And we were discussing how sad it was that we were not able to go back home and share these stories with our family and those that we loved, and how sad it was that humans don't know the truth of what's happening, and that there would be no wars on Earth if people knew what was really going on out there and how wonderful it really was. And we were just talking about this, and there was, entities and people milling around, entering or kind of coming out of this large room. It was like a conference hall type of room. So we're standing there, and I said, well, I'm going to remember this moment. I said, I'm going to remember. And a man, one of the security next to me, says, no, you're not. I'm like, oh, I absolutely am going to remember. And then just at that moment, there were these blue alien entities coming out of that doorway, and they were like arm's length away. And I heard him psychically or telepathically say something to me, catch my attention, say my name probably. So I turned my head and I looked. And as soon as I said, oh, I'm going to remember, I looked at him and he said, and I know you will too. And part of the memories that I began to receive and put together was that was only a moment in a much larger memory that I now have been able to kind of put those pieces together, because it turns out that as an emissary, I don't like to say ambassador, because I don't remember me having that title. Though that was the work I was doing, I don't recall the title, so I don't claim it. But I was there to have to speak, actually. And so I'm speaking, and so that memory was kind of the end of that moment. But prior to that, I was actually in the conference room, and that there was a big meeting about something, and I don't remember what exactly it was about, but I remember it was big, and it was about Earth having to come in and become a larger part of the Confederation and the Federation, and that there were some entities, and there was a program that was set up, and I knew it was very, very old, and that for some reason, because you mentioned the DNA and being able to work certain machinery and certain technology based on your DNA, I was the only one available to be there to actually punch in the code to disarm this program. And part of that program, in speaking with Elena and going over this for the last few months, was because I recall being with entities that we describe now as the Anunnaki. I remember standing in front of them, having conversations, and it was all part of this memory. So in that memory, because I had something to do prior to incarnation, my race had something to do with setting this program up. But since it was going to humans, it had to go through that one of those entities that have been incarnated through the human race, because it's about breaking and abridging free will. As long as a human is doing it for the human race, then it's not considered breaking free will. And so it turns out that was the canceling of basically ownership of Saturn and some other locations within our solar system. And that was being turned over by Inky, who we now refer to as Ea, because he was technically the owner of a lot of territory here in the Anunnaki as a whole. Now I've been able to put that whole memory together now, and that was the event. The event was turning over those properties to Earth humans, rather.
Now, we know that Elena Danan talked about that meeting and witnessing that, or being told about that meeting with Prince Ea handing over the authority for Saturn over to the Earth, and also heard, and I recall Alex Collier also kind of like relaying information he got from the Andromedans, that there was a trial being set up for Enki's brother, Enlil, who was the big troublemaker. Now, are we talking about the same set of events, or are these separate events? I mean, Enki handing over authority, or Prince Ea handing over authority of Saturn to the Earth Alliance and Space Command, or and also this trial of Enlil. Were they separate incidents, or were they the same thing?
They were separate incidences as far as I can recall, because the actual event that I was at on Mimas was because they were handing over Saturn. And as I recall, all the trial type of stuff didn't happen on that station. I believe it was Jupiter, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay. But of course, that's something that Elena described. And she also has described these meetings involving delegates holographically coming in to meet and have a dialogue, kind of like in the Star Wars, I think, the first episodes, or episode 1 and 2, where they had these, the Jedi Knights meeting, and you'd have some physically there, but many of them holographically came in. So was that pretty much the way the meeting that you attended played out?
Well, in my memory, and what I'm feeling is that mostly they were physically there. But also, when you're dealing with just memory, since I'm so visual, my memories are based on those, and so a lot of those holograms, some of those different races, you wouldn't know the difference between them being there solid and a hologram. Now, a lot of what we were using and a lot of other races, you could tell, because I remember being in meetings where I could look at my hand and it would sort of like fade out, like the middle of my finger down begin to slightly fade out, and I never could make sense of that memory. Why is my hand not entirely solid? Well, now that makes sense to me, that I've begun to recall that a lot of my work was holographic. And so our technology wasn't as good as some of the other. And so my memories being that everyone at least looked solid. I think there were probably a couple scattered that I could maybe tell might have been holographic.
So this was a very significant event. I know David Icke, he has talked about the Saturn Moon Earth matrix, or that Saturn and the Moon are somehow critical components of this control grid or the matrix controlling all life on planet Earth. So handing over control of Saturn seems to be, or Mimas and Saturn, handing that over to the Earth Alliance essentially would mean that humanity would be free of this control system. So is that pretty much what you recall, the significance of this handover of authority, that somehow the Earth would now be free?
Yes, exactly. Because the feeling of it is that because the humans are moving into fourth density, a higher understanding, and all the disclosures are going to be coming in the next couple of years, it's really going to be intensified. We kind of had to have that ability to create disclosure and not allow it to be blocked and controlled by nefarious forces. But just as a side note, the Mimas was never a part of Saturn as far as ownership. From about Mimas outward from the orbit of Saturn was not owned by the Anunnaki. It was just the planet and the rings for the most part, at this time at least. So there was no handing over of Mimas, because that was truly a confederation of many, many different races and planets and solar systems.
So what do you recall of the Anunnaki themselves and of Ea that you saw at Mimas?
The only memory I really have is having a discussion with some of these entities that, I can't say 100% that they were Anunnaki, because of the whole name memory thing is very blocked for me. But visually, they look exactly like, I've described them to Elena and some others that know what they look like. And they're like, yeah, that's exactly what they look like. So I remember specifically having conversations with them. I don't remember what the context was. We were just standing out in a mezzanine area, and this one entity that I believe now is Ea, or was Ea, is wearing this robe that was very interesting, and he's about 7-8 feet tall, I'm guessing. But this robe was like a shimmering, it's more like light. It didn't really look physical. And I just remember noticing that it was just like a silver fabric that would kind of wave and move. And it was very iridescent. So it had all the colors, as it moved, it would shimmer different colors. And that's what I remembered, but then around him were, I think, 3 or 4 other entities that were of the same race that had on a black and green suits. And they were kind of backing him up. And so I was just having a conversation with who I believe was Ea. I just 100% can't say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this happened only recently. We're talking kind of like a year ago that this meeting or this handover occurred, and of course you're here living a conventional timeline, but a part of you, your soul extract or consciousness, is living as part of this international space program with another name, having these experiences, and now you're starting to remember that. So, how does that happen? Is the memory something that is being recollected linearly, in terms of, or is it happening directly, some kind of direct connection between you physically here and that version of you that's serving right now?
It's interesting. But that's all true, actually. I found in my experience that there's no real rule to memory recovery. The primary rule that I follow is meditation, to, kind of open my subconscious mind to my conscious mind, and so that some of those memories can come through. But it's also, it sounds really strange, but it's absolutely true that my other aspect of myself has come and visited me and has had some communication with me, and we've met a couple of times, and which is very strange, to have a conversation with yourself that you're physically standing there looking at yourself. It's very, very odd. But for the most part, there's a separation, and that's only been recently because of other events coming in, and me increasing my memories and raising my vibration to a level that can be possible, and so it's a journey, and there's, like I said, there's no real rule, to recovering and putting memories together, and they don't come in linearly, they come in as needed. And then you kind of have to put them together and make sense of the whole memory once you get enough of the pieces together. And then once you kind of like begin to connect the dots, then it's like a framework where more memory can come in. Then they can establish in your mind, and that's how I see it working with me.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that just recently on January 7, Elena says that she saw through the eyes of Thorhan that he was at a Blue Ridge Mountain facility where there was a 4-star general who was there, and Thorhan handed over a device which was containing a disclosure plan. And that disclosure plan presumably involves the galactics kind of putting together a sequence of events that would result in humanity being told the truth about what's happening out there. Now, it sounds like what is happening to you could be part of that plan, because now, I mean, you're meeting that aspect of you, which is part of the International Secret Space Program. You're starting to remember more. You've had meetings with him, and right now we're having a disclosure plan kind of like starting to unfold, with UFOs being suddenly talked about ad nauseum in the mainstream media. At the moment it's a threat, but it soon can easily morph into something else. So I mean, what do you feel? How do you feel about that? I mean, is there a bigger disclosure plan happening, and that you're part of this?
Absolutely. That's the whole point of many of us, and when I say many, I mean, we're talking millions and millions of different, what we call starseeds coming in. And once this process of evolution of the human race has been completed, many of us will go to another planet where their third density going into fourth, and it's just the process. Because what it is, once your race has moved on past like the fourth density or so into the fifth especially, then you've come together enough that you can go and assist other races in their ascension. And so that's just the process. It's very normal, and there's always a plan. And Earth is a little bit special and unusual, because there's been so much negative interference for so very long. And there a lot of things have been put in place to suppress memory and to keep control over population and that type of thing. And so because of those issues, the plan has to be more crafted, and more carefully placed. But it's important that even if you're coming in as another race, that you have to incarnate through that whatever race, in this case is human. You have to incarnate through the humans to have the human experience, to maintain the free will abrogation, so that you don't land a giant spacecraft, into a society that can't handle it, that'll start shooting at you, or that will start shooting at one another, because out of fear, and right now we're not 100% out of that, so like you say, there will be a layout. The plan for Earth and for humans is for it to become more common to see UFOs, so that it will be no big deal. It might be cool to watch, but you're like, okay, yeah, it's a UFO, I get it now. Then the next step would be with them communicating with people more directly, and then, eventually someday landing on the Earth. And it really depends on humans. It truly depends on humans and how we approach the situation. If we can come together as a human race and say, okay, let's accept this. This is the fact. Let's not freak out. Let's not start shooting at things and start going crazy. If we can get to that point, they'll land as soon as we're there, but we're just not there yet.
I've heard similar things from JP, my army source, who very recently was taken into an underground facility in Florida and saw a spaceport with all of these Nordic craft that he has seen before. Actually, he took a photo of one of the craft back in 2018 with two Nordics in it, and I actually did publish it on my website, so that photo is available. But he saw hundreds of these craft in this underground base, and he said they are now working with the underground civilizations, and they are going to start revealing themselves, just as you said. So that does seem to be a disclosure plan where methodically and gradually all humanity is going to be introduced more and more to these strange craft that are flying that no one can explain satisfactorily. And then at some point, the light's going to turn on and it's going to be like, well, they're actually extraterrestrial. But I believe that they'll probably first reveal the secret space program first to just get people's confidence up that, the Earth's nations have their own anti-gravity craft. We can kick butt out there, and then eventually it'll be like, oh, by the way, extraterrestrials are here as well.
Yeah, they've been here all along, and it's so exciting to me because people have no idea. I mean, I know there's a lot of horror stories, because that's just part of life. It's got to be a balance. But the beauty of what's out there, the excitement I know that people will experience, and the joy and the wonders that are available if we're just ready for it, and I can't wait. I remember a lot of it, so it's not going to be such a shock for me, obviously, but I just, people are afraid to let go of old concepts, especially religious concepts that say, if you don't believe this, you're going to go to hell, or you're never going to, be accepted, into a heaven state, which those are all lies, to keep you from opening your mind to accepting, extraterrestrials, to accepting the truth of what's really out there, and those are the reasons, because religion has been a very, very powerful control over humanity for a very long time, and to the point that people have killed over it, and it's been happening for a long, long time here on Earth, and once we can get past the mindset of you not wanting to kill somebody else over the fact they don't believe like you, then we're opening ourselves to being ready to accept the truth.
I think it's very important to mention that there is independent confirmation for the things that you've been describing, the things that Elena has been describing, and the things that JP has been telling me. Recently, a very prominent founder of a Washington, D.C. think tank called the Arlington Institute, John Peterson, and I talked about this in my recent webinar, what's coming in 2023, for those that want to go into this more deeply to find out what he said. But he was told by 3 independent sources, and the important thing is that the Arlington Institute is in no way associated with the UFO movement. It's an independent think tank funded by the US Navy to come up with future scenarios for advanced technologies being kind of disseminated on the Earth, and how the US Navy would respond to all of that. But he was said in an interview he just did recently with Greg Braden, he said that 3 independent, credible sources had told him very similar things to what you and Elena and JP have been saying, that negative extraterrestrials have had to leave, positive extraterrestrials have taken over our solar system and are working with Earth governments, the Earth Alliance, to promote disclosure, and that this is going to be happening very soon. So there's some people that are listening to all of this maybe think, well, this is hopium, or this is kind of like just wishful thinking. But in fact, there's independent corroboration from a very credible Washington area think tank funded by the Navy, confirming a lot of what you've said.
Well, that's amazing. I wasn't aware of that. But and even if there is a dash of hopium in there, we need it. We need hope, and we need to see a future that is real and that is positive and that is loving. And if we don't have that to focus on, we can't manifest it.
Well, there's the old adage, where your attention goes, reality flows.
Oh, yeah.
So you put your attention on positive outcomes. That's the reality you're going to create. And so I'm very glad to be working with you, Elena, Jean-Charles, JP, and others that do have a positive vision, that don't get us to dwell on the gloom and doom scenarios, that we focus on the positive, because the more we focus on the positive, put our attention on that, then we are actually participating in the creation of this incredible new reality. And I think you're doing really wonderful in putting out that message with what you do, and of course your DEEMS device. So maybe as we kind of bring this to a close, you want to just give people an update on the things that you're doing, the DEEMS device, and anything else that you're doing now that can help people prepare for what's coming?
Well, as far as the DEEMS device, that I'm still building them. We're on a hiatus right now. I had a foot injury I'm recovering from, so I can't build at the moment. But so those are still available, and we're in many, many more countries, and I'm just really, really grateful for that. Because that was a piece of technology I brought back. And it was part of my negotiation for my final 20 years was I wanted to bring that technology back. It was called something else. I call it the DEEMS device, because I know humanity needed it. Humans need to understand that we are creating, like you just said, we are creating our reality. Thought is love, and love and thought are what create our current reality. And so this device, the DEEMS device, all it really does is have a magnetic field, and a piezoelectric energy field that it creates. And it's a passive type of technology that just gives your body the ample energy that it needs to do what it needs to do, whether it's work on your energy body, your physical body, for pain relief or healing, because piezoelectric energy is what our brain, our pineal gland, and our nervous system use. So that's the type of understandings that we as humans need to understand, is that all the answers are internal. All the healing is internal. I mean, it's we do it ourselves, our physical body. And so bringing these, because all technology, the highest technology out there in some form or fashion is magnets and crystals. So I'm working on doing research on helping to bring some of the magnetic and crystalline technology here to Earth. The DEEMS is the first of those devices, and I am working on others to do some things I probably shouldn't say what they're quite at this point in time. I will reveal some stuff in October in the JISC conference. So it's a work in progress, and we're doing experiments and trying different crystals and different things to see really what works. And I didn't used to believe in crystal and technology. I really didn't. I did a lot of research for museums around the world, and so I had a very technical thinking type of research mind. But when I began to understand and research, the crystalline structure and the nature of crystals and how energy flows through them, then I began to understand how it is that we are manifesting, our own reality. And so that's the main lesson, and the main purpose for the DEEMS company is to help people learn to do things for themselves.
So where do people go to find out more about the DEEMS and what you're doing? And if they want to get in touch with you, where do they go?
Well, if you want to get in touch, our email is deemsdevice@gmail.com. That's DEEMS device, DEVICE @gmail.com, or you can go to deemscompany.com, and we have our website there.
Well, I want to thank you, Chris, for coming on Exopolitics today and sharing some of your experiences and knowledge about what's happened and what's happening up there in secret space programs. So thank you and aloha.
Oh, thank you, aloha. Michael, for allowing me to be here And thank you everyone for watching. I truly am appreciative of that. So thank you.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.